So the Clone Wars involved the entirety of the galaxy, whether it was an active battlefield or the logistic networks that supplied both factions' military efforts on the countless worlds that did become battlefields on the front lines of this war. So how exactly did these factions move troops to and from the battlefield? Well, today we're going to dive into this and focus specifically on the Separatist side of the war and how the Separatists moved around their massive droid army. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. Now, the droid army really can't even be described in numbers. It was incomprehensibly large, which makes sense. The battle droids were relatively cheap to manufacture, they were easy to store, they were fairly light on the needs of supplies and equipment, and they could be tucked away and pulled out when needed. But how exactly do you move an army this big around the galaxy? Well, before we dive into this, I want to throw out there that I'm not talking about specific supply lines or anything like that today. I'm going to be talking about the general overarching infrastructure set up by the CIS, the vehicles and equipment and processes that would be used to move battle droids around the galaxy. A good portion of this video is going to be speculation based on what we see during the Clone Wars TV show, and a little bit during the movies, but mostly during the TV show. So I'm drawing some conclusions here, but I am using a lot of direct sources from that. So let's just start where all of this begins, at a factory deep in Separatist territory. The droid foundries of the CIS worked basically the entirety of the war to turn out as many active and functional battle droids as possible to be pushed to the front lines of the conflict, and there were several of these factories. These factories could turn out thousands of droids in a day, and often did just that, resulting in these massive stockyards of battle droids ready for combat outside these factories. They might have still needed a little bit of weapons and equipment, things like the E5 blaster rifle used by many B-1 battle droids during the war, but the droids themselves would have been ready for combat. They would likely be in that sleep mode that we see the OOM series battle droids stored in during the events of the Naboo crisis, but they were still ready for combat. At that point, they could be loaded onto a transport. Now, they likely aren't just shoveled onto a transport, but instead placed on the types of racks we see on the MTTs. In fact, they're likely placed on the MTTs and other similar vehicles like the platoon assault craft, for example, and then moved to larger transports. Think C-9979s or maybe even landed Lucrehulk-class core ships. These could also be shuttle vehicles like some extended variants of the Sheathipede-class shuttle, which would move these droids up to vessels that were not quite as capable of landing, things like the Munificent-class frigate. From there, they could be loaded onto these vehicles. Now, if the Separatists were carrying out a planetary invasion, contrary to what we see on screen, they're likely not relying entirely on Munificent-class frigates, since they don't seem to have very advanced landing capabilities. Instead, I would expect them to use things like Lucrehulk-class battleships or their core ship-based transports as staging areas for planetary invasions. They might even just use some C-9979s that follow the warships through hyperspace. So that's how they're deployed to the front. However, it's likely they're not deployed directly to the front. The theory I have is that they were likely mustered in large droid staging areas far behind the front lines, but still close enough where they could be rapidly deployed to battlefields as needed. As such, these droids could be amassed in large store yards with transports ready to go, likely on the transports ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. And it's also worth noting that during this entire time, the droid is likely still in the shutdown state it left the factory in. It may have been powered up to guarantee that it works, but in general, this droid has existed its entire life in that balled up position if we're talking about a B1, or in a simply static position if we're talking about a B2. Some of these droids would have been destined for service as, I'm going to call them droid marines, the battle droids stationed on board ships that aren't necessarily intended for planetary invasions. Those droids would just be delivered directly to the ships they're assigned to via some sort of transport. Maybe a C-9979, but more likely a modified Sheathipede designed for carrying cargo. And they ultimately have the simplest logistics, because once they arrive on their designated vessel, they're put into whatever storage the vessel's security forces have set up for them, and they wait there until they're activated and used, and at that point they're in active service, operating on the closest thing to a battlefield they'll operate on. The droids destined for planetary invasion forces are a little bit different. So, like I said, these ones likely waited in store yards behind the front lines until they were needed, unless there were active battles going on, in which case maybe they were simply piped directly from the factory via their transports straight to the battlefield. Now, as I mentioned, many of these transports were likely large capital ships like the Lucrehulk class battleships, for example, which would serve as an entire invasion fleet in themselves, being able to carry enough troops to easily overwhelm basically any planetary government. They would lean on vessels like the C-9979 as large-scale landing craft to move these droids from orbit to the surface of a planet, which would also be viable for moving large numbers of droids from the surface of a planet back to space, which is part of this chain that's often forgotten. Once a battle is won and a planet is firmly in the hands of the CIS, most, if not all, of those battle droids must be withdrawn to be used elsewhere in the war. After all, while the battle droids are incredibly numerous, they are still technically a finite resource, and their deployment does still need to be thoughtful and well executed. So it doesn't make sense to necessarily just leave an entire planetary invasion force on a planet that's now firmly in Separatist control. So these droids had to be loaded back onto these transports and sent back to space, and we actually do see this happen a couple times in the TV show. They're likely loaded on the same way they came down, aboard MTTs, or perhaps in open platoon formation, but I think that's a little bit rarer. And once they're shipped off-world, my theory is they likely go back to those same store yards behind the front lines to await their next deployment. Once again, that entire waiting time, they're likely in that shutdown state. It just makes the most sense. It's also worth bringing up that, as I mentioned a few weeks ago in a video on the way the Separatists maintain their droids, that during all of this transit, the droid is likely receiving a constant stream of exterior power to charge its batteries, and regular maintenance if the droid has been in service for a long time, albeit that maintenance is likely not very intensive because these battle droids are incredibly cheap. All things considered, the Separatist military logistic chain is a massive ballet of various vehicles and pieces of military equipment, moving the unthinkably large droid army around the galaxy in an impressively quick amount of time. If you'd like to learn about some of the vehicles used in this process and dive a little bit deeper into some of the equipment used by the CIS during these kinds of operations, I'll leave a link up here to a video I made earlier this week about the C-9979, a key piece of logistical equipment deployed by the Separatists, specifically for moving troops. And I'd like to let me know down in the comments what you think about my theory of the sort of staging areas behind the front lines. Do you think the Separatists did keep stockpiles of battle droids in sort of hubs behind the front lines of the war, or do you think they were simply piped directly to and from the factory to the battlefield, and that middleman was completely cut out? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars or anywhere else in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.